Thank you so much, Ida. My name is Katherine McKay. I'm the Senior Program Manager for the EPIC initiative at Aspen FSP. And that means that I have been leading our work on housing since 2018, and also that I am really excited to share what we've learned and introduce our fantastic panel so that you can hear more about how this actually happens on the ground in local communities. I'm going to share my screen and get started on a presentation that'll go about 15 minutes, and then I'll turn it over to my colleague Tim and our panelists. So here we are, January 2021. We began in 2018. What we do, what you'll hear about over the next 15 minutes is what we do, which is connecting one consequential issue to people's financial security, researching it in depth for several years, diagnosing the underlying problems that lead that issue to be a source of financial insecurity, and then develop a menu of solutions that people who are key stakeholders in every involved sector can use to help advance solutions. Of course, there's COVID-19 in the middle of that, because this was not an ordinary time to be working on housing security. This was, in fact, a historic moment for housing insecurity. Why housing? It's really simple. Housing is the necessary foundation of financial security. It's almost every family's largest expense, and the only way that people can have the basics that they need to thrive is to start with stable housing. We also know that solving for housing security improves people's lives. We did a survey last fall with SaberLife of 499 of their members, asking a variety of questions about their housing security and insecurity experiences, and ending with an open-ended question: how would your life change if your housing challenges were solved? Every single one of the most common responses listed here: less stress, more savings, better housing, more job security, getting a better job, buying a house and building wealth. All of those connect directly to financial security and would help people build that, as well as making their housing a better situation for them. And then finally, this is not just an isolated problem. People's housing security affects everyone, and everyone benefits when families have stable housing that they can afford. That includes education systems where students who are experiencing instability really struggle and often don't graduate. It includes healthcare systems that have large unreimbursed costs when they help people who've lost their housing, and who also have to treat chronic illnesses that result from unhealthy housing, like asthma. Government benefits, fairly obviously, spending less, bringing in more tax revenue, and businesses as well, particularly employers. So I've mentioned this is a multi-year project. Just quickly to make sure that you know how much of our homework we really have done. These are the inputs that went into it. Both the first year of deep research, putting together our research primer, and then also this year, doing a solution scan, running additional surveys, the SaberLife survey that I mentioned. And as we tallied up everything several months back, we realized, wow, we engaged with over 100 individual people during this process through an interview or a roundtable event. And these folks come from every sector, every different type of perspective on housing. And this really helps us develop a point of view that is integrated, that takes into account all of the different ways of looking at the problem and looking at solutions. And we really believe that that makes our work stronger. So the housing primer, if you have not read that nearly 100-page report, I encourage you to. It's great, but also it can be boiled down more or less to this slide. The housing crisis that started building in the early 2000s has 4 core underlying drivers. First, there is not enough new housing to meet growing demand. Second, many families can't afford the housing options available to them. That's not just low-income and moderate-income families, but in many places, also middle-class households. discrimination continues to harm people of color. Other groups experience discrimination as well, particularly disabled folks and LGBTQ communities, but the legacy, the history, and the impact on Black and Brown communities throughout the United States cannot be understated, and it is a current day problem too. And then finally, current policy disadvantages renters. So we published this problem diagnosis in January 2020, just about 51 weeks ago. And right after that, the US went into lockdown. We had just started work on the Housing Security Solutions Framework that we have released today. And what we did immediately was kind of pause, take a step back, start observing, make sure that we had a sense of what was really happening with people's housing security, whether it was the same, different drivers than what we had already seen. And where we came to was that those 4 core drivers laid the groundwork for this. We had a slow build crisis. We had a crisis that affected about 100 million Americans living in housing that they couldn't afford based on their income. Now we're talking about much greater levels of risk than just struggling to pay for your rent or mortgage. Now we're talking about 30 to 40 million renters at risk of eviction. As of the end of the year, 8% of mortgage loans are delinquent. Now, the Great Recession peak was 10%. That we're getting close to what had been an almost unimaginable record for the second time in a decade. And then we know that the number of people experiencing homelessness is rising in a number of major cities. I want to dig in a little bit on that eviction estimate. Many of you have heard that 30 to 40 million Americans are at risk right now as of the end of 2020. Aspen FSP produced this estimate with our partners at the COVID-19 Eviction Defense Project, and using data from April, June, and November, have tracked the number of renters at risk of eviction over several months. At this point, about 1 in 5 renter households are behind on their rent. That's huge. And just like we saw before COVID, looking at housing insecurity, the same groups are at the highest levels of risk. It's Black renter households, Latinx renter households, and those with kids who are facing the highest level of challenge right now. I also want to point out each one of these states here represented in red, more than 30% of their renter households are at risk right now. This is a crisis, and it's a crisis that we cannot afford to ignore. Thankfully, one of the things that makes it a crisis that we know how to solve is that we know what works in eviction prevention. We know what works in rapidly rehousing people who do unfortunately lose their housing. And we know what works in terms of helping people in court. What we need to do is connect the immediate absolute crisis need and the solutions there to the medium-term and long-term solutions that are needed to address those same underlying drivers of these problems. Now, before 2020, not every one of these stakeholders listed on this slide may have thought of themselves as COVID-19 crisis housing stakeholders, but everyone is. We all stand to lose if people experience long-term housing insecurities stemming from a pandemic that, while much longer than we had hoped, is still a short-term phenomenon in the larger span of people's lives. So the full report has explicit, well-organized, specific ideas for a wide variety of stakeholders. And if you are seeing yourself in this list here, there is something for you in the report, and we really encourage you to dive into the full version. It was a challenge to determine what solutions went into the framework, given how much there is out there. So we established a couple of criteria. First, even to be considered, solutions needed to be scalable, effective in multiple types of markets, not just one particular, and either backed by empirical evidence of their effectiveness, or they're innovative, have the potential to scale and, in our view, deserve an opportunity to prove their effectiveness. And then the second piece is effective is not enough. You also need to have solutions that are equitable and that are sustainable over time. So we developed a set of design principles that we recommend that people use as they determine what challenges to prioritize solving and then what types of solutions are appropriate. I'm going to walk through each of these, but I want to also first say there is no solution out there that checks all 5 boxes. Again, it's prioritizing is key, and also, determining which of these design principles will do the most good in your community is a good way to start. Discrimination in housing, I've mentioned it. I've mentioned not just racial and ethnic. I've also mentioned other forms. There are a number of protected classes under the law, and most of them do not actually experience fair housing. That's critically important. One way that could be improved upon is a lot more money. If federal policymakers fully funded the cost of rigorous fair housing enforcement, in all likelihood, the situation would be better. And there are great guides and recommendations for them on how to do that. Second, make it easier to build all types of housing. We need the full spectrum. We don't need to necessarily pay as a public subsidy towards luxury high rises, but people want to live in them, and there's people who need housing. And that goes all the way from that to accessory dwelling units and manufactured homes. More than that, well, in addition to that, homes need to be located where people need them to be. It is true that there's a lot of vacant housing across the country, but it's not in the places where people need it. One example there is housing developers implementing universal design standards. That may not seem as intuitively obvious, but one of the things that we really seriously lack is housing that is accessible and that can help people who are disabled and those who are aging to stay in their homes. Third, preserve both subsidized and market rate affordable housing. That market rate often gets called NOAA, naturally occurring affordable housing. It is important to do both because the vast majority of lower cost housing is not subsidized, and it is at risk because it is older. It is owned in general by small landlords who often are using it as a retirement income stream, and there is a lot of risk that those will be purchased and transitioned out of lower cost and instead become rehabilitated, expensive apartments. Fourth, support households directly. There's a big gap between what especially low-income households can pay and the cost of housing. The number one thing that needs to happen here is for rental assistance to become an entitlement for everyone who's eligible. Right now, it is a sad fraction of everyone who's eligible who actually gets any type of federal rental assistance. And then finally, support renters' well-being. They face very challenging circumstances when they have disputes with their landlords and when they can't pay their rent. And that's something you're seeing play out in spectacular fashion right now, but it's something that is also a long-running challenge. A big piece of the problem is the lack of eviction prevention programs and the lack of legal representation that people have when they're in landlord-tenant court. State policymakers have started pouring more money into those in the short term to match the current crisis. And we hope that that is something that gets ramped down as it is less needed, but not zeroed out. It's funding that really will play an important role in people's housing security in the future. Quickly, I want to just go over why we match certain solutions to different levels, federal, state, and local government, I'm going to focus on here. In the report, we also differentiate between national financial institutions and your friendly local community bank. The federal government has the money. It has the money and it has the regulatory power and the enforcement power. And it is the only institution with the power to do those things effectively. So we recommend that federal policymakers focus on those particular things: funding for the policies that are needed, and especially regulating and enforcing fair housing and anti-discrimination laws. I mentioned that the number one thing would be for Congress to provide federal housing assistance to everyone who is eligible. If one thing is all that can happen, this is the thing. It's not just the only thing, that said. There are so many. Local policymakers are the folks who make the decisions on the ground about which problems they are going to develop solutions to that reflect their local communities. They are most directly affected by the negative impacts because they are the folks who have to run those school systems. They are the folks who deal with the healthcare systems. They are the ones who are spending money that they don't have and losing tax revenues. So they have these strong incentives that make them great leaders on housing security solutions when they are committed. So some of the things that we've recommended for them really relate to the specifics of their communities, their land, their neighborhood, their neighborhoods, and things that are very much local and specific. So we also developed universal design principles that, we also developed a process for creating housing solutions on the ground. The first thing, the most critical thing, is building partnerships, especially with people who have lived experiences of housing insecurity. You need to have everyone's perspective in the process from the beginning of diagnosing the problems and identifying who is really suffering from those problems. And that requires working with people from the beginning who don't normally have their voices heard, along with all of the other stakeholders who need to be part of the process for it to succeed. Once you've done that diagnosis, identifying solutions that specifically match those problems is something that the solutions framework is really good for, but an important next step. And then prioritize among them. Which solutions are the right ones for your community, are the ones that you can actually make progress on, whatever it is that your set of criteria are. We recommend using those universal design principles and also tailoring an out-of-the-box policy really closely to your community needs. Out-of-the-box policies will not have the level of results that ideally you would want to see when you invest all of this time and energy from partnerships through actually advancing policies. That is the end of my presentation. You are going to hear in just a moment about how leaders on the ground actually do that, how they do the process of working with diverse coalitions, identifying the right stakeholders, building trust, supporting community leadership, and prioritizing. It is really important work. It involves everyone needing to be at the table. And so we've put together a panel that kind of represents that everyone. From the nonprofit sector to the public sector to the financial sector. Now I invite my colleague Tim Shaw to turn on his camera and unmute himself to introduce the panel and continue on our event journey. Thanks, Tim.